morning, Warsaw! Today is Wednesday, 9th of August. It will be sunny in the morning but cloudy with showers in the evening, with highs of 17 degrees Celsius or 62 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:24 a.m. and sunset at 8:30 p.m. We are on the ninth day of the Warsaw Uprising. Polish aeroplanes are seen in the sky, which sounds promising. But what else is happening today, Alina?
I'm loving these intros, Philippe. Thank you so much. Well, today, the Polish radio resumes, and Claire's going to tell us a little bit more about that.
That's right, Alina. So after 5 years of Nazi German occupation, Polish radio, normal radio for civilians, resumes broadcasting on the 9th of August. So, of course, there aren't very many radio sets there. It was illegal to have a radio set during the occupation anyhow. I mean, there have been a number of sets that have been hidden in basements and so on. And so they are now brought out. But the insurgents said that to broadcast this further, they install loudspeakers in the streets. And they're broadcasting to themselves, news of what's happening, motivation, morale of the civilian population is also very important at this point. But they're also broadcasting out to other ally governments as well. We've heard a bit what's happening in Britain, Britain's response, what's happening in Moscow as well, of course, with their propaganda. But what's the American response, Roger?
Well, the Americans were rather too punctilious in this respect, that they were more than willing to respect Warsaw as being in the Soviet area of operation. So they were always willing to defer to the Soviets. So essentially, what we might now call sort of kicking the can down the road and not wishing to, first of all, not wishing to upset their Soviet ally, but also not wishing to sort of, tread on their toes and make any sort of unilateral decisions about Warsaw. There is a sort of foreshadowing of a possibility here, which comes in much later on, which is that the Americans did declare themselves willing to carry out large-scale airdrops over Warsaw, but on condition that those aircraft, because of the distance involved, those aircraft had to be able to land on Soviet territory. So this required, again, it deferred to the Soviets. It required Soviet consent to allow them to land, to refuel, and to take off again. And for the moment, that consent on the Soviet side was withheld. So from the American perspective, this meant that there was essentially nothing that the Americans could do. So from the Americans' view on this was essentially that there was nothing that was possible at the moment, and they had to wait and see and wait on Soviet permission.
And of course, they are very concerned about the Soviet response. I mean, the Allies are exhausted. It's 1944. We're not going to keep fighting for much longer. They don't have the resources. They don't have the public will in Britain or in America to support an ongoing conflict against the Soviets. The last thing they want to do is to open up a rift between Moscow and America. So there is this, and of course it's an election year. He's worried about his own position in the polls. So there's multiple pressures on America as well.
That's absolutely right. The problem always is with the Western Allies is that they have to have one eye on their civilian populations, on the death toll that's being totted up at the front, which is something, of course, that the Soviets really don't have to worry so much about because they have such a firm grip, and the propaganda of the Soviet system and so on can always cover these things up. So they are absolutely vitally engaged in keeping the Soviets on board, because the Soviets are doing the lion's share of the fighting against the Germans. That's undoubtable, and they have to keep them on board to make sure that alliance can get through to the end of the fight against Nazi Germany, whatever happens next. But it was crucial to keep the Soviets on board, and very often that meant that the Poles were stuck between those two powers, effectively lost out. They no longer had the ear of the British or the Americans because the Soviet connection was considered more important.
All of which underlines how vitally important it was, that radio voice from Warsaw itself, because no one is speaking for them. They have to get their own story out. So Roger covered some of the reasons why the Americans aren't ready to bring in supplies yet. What is happening? What's the situation with airdrops, Alina?
Thanks for that, Claire. It's going to be a pretty short one from me, actually, because we have 4 Polish crews who are carrying out airdrops over the Campinos forest, which is about northwest of Warsaw. And the other interesting note about this is that during the conference of the Mediterranean Allied Air Force, bit of a mouthful there, in Naples, was attended by Winston Churchill. And there, a decision was made to send the British 178 RAF squadron and the South African 31st squadron to carry out airdrops over the Warsaw zone. And that's really important. We've got to remember that the pilots were not allowed to fly directly over Warsaw. There was a ban, and they were only allowed to fly over the outskirts. And of course, as we know, earlier in the week, the Poles completely and utterly ignored that and did so anyway. But now they're finally being able to fly over the Warsaw zone to do proper Allied drops. Also, Churchill ends up cabling Stalin with a request for more weapons and ammunitions for the Warsaw Uprising, for the insurgents. As we very well know, he ignores that. This is not his goal, because Stalin doesn't care. He wants the Warsaw Uprising to fail. And Roger will be talking a little bit more about the Soviets and their participation a little bit later, and how they pretty much don't help and sit on the other side of the bank and watch as Warsaw burns, really. That's it from me, really, about what's happening in the air. But there's other things happening on the ground. Claire, that's your cup of tea. What's going on there?
But obviously, the civilians and the insurgents are suffering terribly under these ongoing bombardments. There's another character I'd like to mention. Her name is Zofia Franio. She is, before the war, she was part of the Women's Auxiliary Military Force. She was a trained doctor. She was absolutely brilliant in every way. She had hidden a couple of Polish Jews in her apartment to save them from the ghetto. She was later given Righteous Among Nations recognition. But she was also a trained sapper, and she was a qualified medical doctor as well. Earlier on, before the uprising, she'd been involved. She'd organised these groups of women to become trained sappers and also to be bomb makers. And she'd been involved in sabotage of rail lines before. In fact, she'd been almost caught because the suitcase full of explosives she was taking to do a mining operation, a bombing operation on some railway tracks, was so heavy that the handle of her case ripped off, and she had to kind of nudge it through controls with her foot because she could hardly carry it under her arm. It was so heavy. So she's quite a woman. She was caught in a bombardment when she was working in a field hospital, because she's doing multiple roles. She was actually carrying a casualty from one bombing raid downstairs into the basement ward. They have a lot of these field hospitals in the basements where they were slightly better protected, when her building took a direct hit. And as she was blown down the stairs, she did manage to keep the stretcher level, and that's just the day-to-day conditions they were working in. But as well as doing that much, she was still commanding her sapper units. So we've talked a lot about going through the sewers, but there was another subterranean passage system that the insurgents had set up. And her sapper units of women were involved in blasting through holes between the cellars, connecting cellars of buildings as well, to create shortcuts for the Home Army soldiers to circle round or safely reach their new battle positions, but also to enable them to take people to the cellar-based hospitals that I was talking about. These women are wonderful. I mean, they were nicknamed the Bombs, their units. Bull Komorowski, one of the generals of the Rising, notes in his memoirs even later how incredibly brave they were. And he said that watching them and the female medics changed his view on the abilities of women and what they could achieve, because they were, undaunted. Even in bombing raids, they carried on with their work. And one of the AK soldiers, one of the Home Army soldiers, said about these women's groups, the Bombs, he said, they are superb girls. When necessary, they will blow up a wall. When you get hurt, they will dress your wounds, and when they get wounded, they're like to carry. Except Alina, they said. She's quite heavy. So they had this very jokey, very good relationship with them. Alina's face, I wish you guys could see it. So yeah, they're doing all of this work, but they're also creating a lot of the ammo and armaments as well. So they're still making petrol bombs. Petrol bombs are actually one of the most effective weapons against the enemy tanks. So they're making those. They've got these bomb making factories, different buildings to the hospitals, I should emphasize. So they're capturing and dismantling artillery shells from the enemy. They're redeploying the explosives, the TNT. Sometimes they'd have to pulverize it into powder. and compact it, and they'd shove it into glass jars or small metal tins from cleaning projects, any of these sort of containers that they could reuse. And then then these weapons were taken out to the front line, delivered by women's teams again out to the front line for use. Zoe came to deliver supplies to Sofia Franio in her bomb-making factory. And she was horrified because she saw that her friend Sofia's lips had turned dark blue and her skin was very, very grey. And it turns out that when you're pulverizing TNT, it's poisonous. And the women were being slowly poisoned by this lab on top of all the other risks they were having. So being a doctor, Sophia Franny had very wisely created a shift system so the women would take turns to recover. And what she asked Zoe to supply was milk. Fresh milk, apparently, would have been able to ease some of their symptoms. But Zoe scoured the city, sent her people out. But unfortunately, at this point, milk is virtually, it's unheard of in the city. So, yeah, that's the situation on the ground.
As we're talking about doctors, I thought I'd jump in here with a very quick story about some of the nurses who participated in the Warsaw Uprising. And the nurse I want to talk about is Zofia Józefa Piwnicka, who was only 19 years old when she partook in the Warsaw Uprising. And it's on this day that she was actually murdered during the uprising. So she was out on Pola Mokotowskie, which is in the southern part of Warsaw, near Mokotów. And she was with a friend of hers coming across the fields, and she was shot by the Germans, basically. The problem here is that her body's never been found, and this happened quite a lot. There are a lot of bodies and a lot of people that have never been found during the Warsaw Uprising. Either their bodies have been cremated, destroyed, evaporated, or they just can't be identified. That's the other issue. Sometimes bodies can never just be identified by who they are. The other really sad thing about the story is her sister Kazimierza, who was also a nurse. She was actually killed on the second day of the uprising. So we've got to remember, during the uprising, sometimes whole families were destroyed, brothers and sisters. There was even on this day one set of twins. So one of the brothers of a set of twins was killed during the uprising, and his brother dies about a couple of weeks later. So husbands, wives, everybody. It's a bit of a sad story here. So amongst all the death and murder that's happening in Warsaw, one thing we haven't really talked about much in the past few days is the reaction of the Germans. And I think, Roger, you've got a couple of words to add about what the Germans are doing.
Well, it's interesting that on this day that the Germans are already sort of feeling the heat somewhat in Warsaw, which is quite telling. The civilian authorities, if such a thing kind of existed, but the administrative authorities of Warsaw made the decision to flee the city on the 9th of August. They had been ensconced in the Brule Palace in the centre of Warsaw for the duration of the occupation, right the way from the end of September 1939 onwards. And the decision was made because of pressure from various insurgent groups in that district to evacuate. And in the process of the evacuation, actually, the deputy of the administrative commander, Ludwig Fischer, was actually killed by insurgents. So they make the decision to evacuate, and even the military are also feeling the heat as well. So there's a lovely diary entry from SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski on this day, where he notes the following. He says, "Today before noon we are back in Warsaw fighting the uprising. There was a non-stop deliberation at my command post until now. I am lacking strength on all sides," he says. "I also have no helpers because Goltz, the chief of police, had a car accident. If only we could hold Warsaw," he says. So you can see that both the civilian arm and the military are feeling a degree of pressure already on the 9th of August.
And that is the end of day 9 on this podcast. I know some of you may have been wanting the podcast to be a little bit longer, but you've got to remember we have 65 of these to go through, and we still have another 8 weeks to go. But we will see you tomorrow for day 10.